Hello, my dear friends. They used to lick their hands after holding public doorknobs, kiss each other on the cheek to greet each other, and wash their towels with their baby diapers. These were not rare accidents, but daily routines for countless Victorian women. They called it politeness, natural neatness, and feminine culture. But beneath the floral dresses and gentle smiles, germs quietly spread with every touch, every hug, every sip of shared tea. Tonight, join me in opening the door to a world that seems elegant but is filled with the silent dangers of seemingly harmless things. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If a woman in Victorian times wanted to be admired for her pale complexion, she often turned to creams made with lead and mercury. These mixtures promised a face as white as porcelain, a sign of refinement and beauty. The jars were sold openly in markets and pharmacies, packaged as though they were remedies or luxuries, while in truth they were slow-acting poisons. The creams clung to the skin, day after day, layered thick without proper washing. What looked like elegance on the surface was in fact the beginning of deep and lasting harm. The habit of painting the face with these powders was not confined to the wealthy. Even women with little money found cheap versions of the creams, made with the same deadly ingredients but mixed more crudely. The white paste gave them the look that society demanded, a kind of proof that they belonged in polite company. Once applied, it sat heavily on the skin, sealing pores and burning slowly. Without daily cleansing, which was rare in Victorian routines, the layers hardened. Dust and sweat only made the mixture worse, forming a crust that women wore like a mask. Doctors of the period noticed the damage but had little influence. They saw women losing their hair, their teeth darkening, and their skin breaking into sores. Still, the products remained popular. Beauty was a form of survival in that society, and the price of beauty was accepted, even if the price was illness. The creams carried a faint metallic taste when they touched the lips, but this too was ignored. The marketplace continued to thrive on the ignorance and desperation of women who only wished to be seen as proper. Lead was known to weaken the body, but in cosmetics it had an allure. Its chalky texture gave the illusion of purity. Mercury, added for brightness, brought a sheen that looked like health, but was really decay. With each use, the toxins are passed through the skin into the bloodstream, settling in nerves and organs. Women grew tired, their hands trembled, and their thoughts dulled. Yet these changes came slowly enough that few connected them to the creams. In crowded dressing rooms, women passed jars between one another, speaking softly about the newest brand or the smoothness of a certain paste. There was no concern for safety, no knowledge of long-term harm. The smell of the creams filled the air, sharp and chemical. Once smeared across the cheeks, the appearance was striking. The skin looked even, free of blemish, glowing under the dim gas lamps. Behind the glow was damage building layer by layer. It almost feels absurd that what was called refinement was really just rubbing poison on the skin every morning. The cycle of harm continued because alternatives were rare. Proper soap and clean water were luxuries for many households. Washing one's face daily was not part of common custom, so the layers of cream remained intact. By the week's end, a woman's face might carry the residue of every morning before it. The powder gathered in lines and creases, making removal more difficult. Any attempt to scrub caused redness, which in turn encouraged the use of more cream to hide it. Reports of sickness made their way into newspapers, but these were often dismissed as exaggeration. The link between cosmetics and illness was too inconvenient to acknowledge. Merchants denied any danger, and customers kept buying. The desire to look pale and proper outweighed fears of unseen consequences. Even when a neighbour fell ill, it was easier to assume she was naturally weak rather than poisoned. The myth of fragile women fits well with society's expectations, hiding the truth of chemical harm. In homes, jars of cream stood next to mirrors, ready for use. A mother might pass her habits down to her daughter, sharing the same jar and the same risks. The cream's smell became familiar, part of the household routine. Its smooth texture comforted women who longed to meet the rigid standards placed upon them. Beneath that comfort, lead and mercury worked their way deeper, eroding health in silence. It is not hard to compare this with modern cosmetics that sometimes hide harsh chemicals under bright labels, though today we at least expect someone to test them before sale. The results grew worse with time. Women reported numbness in their fingers, difficulty in speaking, and sudden fainting. Some lost their hair entirely. The face that once looked smooth began to sag, leaving behind the very flaws the creams had promised to conceal. Families watched their mothers and daughters decline, but explanations were vague. Weak nerves, poor diet, or natural frailty were blamed instead. The true reason remained unspoken, buried beneath layers of powder. I find myself unsettled when thinking about how willingly people accepted damage for the sake of appearances, as if pain and beauty were expected to live together. This practice reveals much about the era. A society that spoke so loudly of morality was comfortable with poisoning its women in the name of elegance. The empire prided itself on progress, yet could not protect half its population from the dangers of daily vanity. The white face that symbolized refinement was nothing more than a mask hiding silent decay. Every application added another measure of harm, invisible but real. Women stepped into public life with smiles, their cheeks powdered white, their lips touched with colour. No one spoke of the shaking hands, the headaches, the dull eyes. The creams promised purity, but delivered slow ruin. Shops thrived, chemists mixed new jars, and the cycle of selling and buying continued. It was a quiet disaster, repeated across drawing rooms and marketplaces, accepted as normal. The story of lead and mercury in cosmetics is more than a detail of fashion. It is a glimpse into a world where survival often meant harm disguised as beauty. Poverty, ignorance, and rigid standards all played a part. The white face of a Victorian lady was not a sign of health, but of a society willing to sacrifice safety for appearance. It was a reflection of values that prized image over truth, leaving scars that could not be hidden forever. The white powders on the skin were a slow betrayal. They seemed to promise refinement but delivered weakness and illness. Behind every painted face was a hidden cost, one that families learned only when it was too late. The use of poisonous creams left women weak and broken, even as society praised their pale beauty. The routines of daily life carried the danger forward without question. And while these creams ruined the health of countless women, another habit just as ordinary carried its own risks, passed from one head to another in silence. The comb sat on a wooden shelf, always within reach, and it belonged to everyone in the household. Mothers used it first, smoothing their hair before stepping into the day. Daughters followed, running it quickly through their own strands, and then the servant girl finished the routine, leaving the teeth clogged with oil and dust. The comb was rarely washed, never scrubbed, and no one considered that it might carry more than just hair. It looked harmless, a simple object of daily life. Yet it became a quiet bridge for infection. Hair care in Victorian homes did not resemble what we think of today. Shampoo did not exist in the form we now know, and clean water was a limited luxury. Women rubbed their hair with mixtures of animal fat blended with crushed flowers, believing this softened strands and gave them shine. The smell was strong, heavy, and not entirely pleasant, but it was a habit that families accepted. When combs passed through such coated hair, they picked up more than oil. Bits of skin, sweat, and unseen fungi clung to the wood and stayed there until the next head received them. This sharing of a single tool seemed efficient, even sensible, in houses where money was scarce. Buying several combs was unnecessary when one could serve all. No one saw danger in this practice, only convenience. The poor did not own many personal items, and privacy in grooming was rare. Yet in this economy of objects, disease found an easy path. It feels almost comical now to think of families carefully sharing one filthy comb as if that counted as care. Head lice thrived in such conditions. They crawled from one scalp to another with little effort, settling in hair that was seldom cleaned. Once lice appeared, itching followed, but scratching only made wounds worse. Fungal infections also spread quickly, leaving patches of scaling skin and bald spots that were slow to heal. Some women believed these marks were a sign of weak blood or bad fortune, never realizing the true cause was the comb sitting in plain sight. The servants suffered most. They often used the comb last, after the others had already left their residue. Their hair carried the burdens of every head before them, and their complaints were rarely heard. Even in wealthier homes, where more than one comb might exist, the practice of sharing remained common. There was little awareness of hygiene or the concept of personal items. To Victorian households, hair care was a communal act, not an individual one. Doctors sometimes noted the link between shared tools and outbreaks of scalp disease, but their warnings carried little weight. Without the science of microbes, most people dismissed the idea of invisible causes. They saw lice as inevitable, not preventable, and fungi as a nuisance rather than a threat. Women wore bonnets and caps, which helped conceal the sores, so the problem remained hidden in plain sight. Families continued their routines, scratching at night, combing each morning, never breaking the cycle. The setting of the market added another layer of risk. Combs were sold cheaply, carved roughly from wood or bone, and displayed in piles. Buyers handled them freely, turning them over with dirty fingers before choosing one. Any object purchased there already carried the marks of many hands. Once brought home, the comb simply joined the chain of transmission. Its surface trapped everything it touched, and in houses where washing tools was unheard of, this became a permanent reservoir of infection. Children were especially vulnerable. Their scalps were tender, and they scratched until bleeding. Small wounds opened paths for deeper infection, leading to swollen glands and fevers. Parents did not always connect these illnesses to the comb. They believed children were naturally fragile, quick to fall sick. In reality, the tool they trusted to tidy hair was slowly undermining their health. If we imagine this habit today, it would be like an entire household brushing their teeth with the same unwashed toothbrush day after day. The consequences stretched beyond physical harm. Girls with patchy hair often faced shame. Beauty standards were strict, and visible marks on the scalp could be seen as a sign of neglect or poverty. Yet the very effort to look presentable, to keep hair neat and smooth, was what spread the problem. The contradiction reveals the strange balance of Victorian life, where appearances mattered more than the hidden truths beneath them. I cannot help but think of how something as ordinary as grooming could quietly decide who remained healthy and who carried scars for life. Over time, infestations grew so common that they became normalized. Mothers expected children to have lice at some point. Servants accepted constant itching as part of their lot. Remedies existed, such as vinegar rinses or herbal washes, but these were not always affordable or used consistently. Without regular cleaning, even the remedies failed. The comb remained central, passed from hand to hand, binding the household together in sickness. Inside dimly lit rooms, where candles flickered against mirrors, the act was repeated daily. One woman's hair was smoothed, then another's, until the teeth of the comb were thick with residue. The surface gleamed from grease, and sometimes strands dangled from its edges, but no one paused to clean it. It seemed unthinkable to waste time scrubbing such a tool when there was work to be done. The object was too ordinary to attract suspicion, too necessary to discard. This detail of domestic life may seem small, but it reflects the larger truths of the age. In a society without clear knowledge of hygiene, the smallest habits carried enormous risks. What was seen as thrift or efficiency could become a silent danger. Families passed down traditions, not realizing they also passed down infections. The comb was not just a tool but a vessel, carrying the traces of every user, weaving health and sickness together in ways they could not imagine. The shared comb connected people physically, its teeth scratching through every scalp in turn. With each stroke, it moved more than hair. It spread discomfort, infection, and weakness, hidden under the guise of care. The family ritual of grooming was, in truth, a ritual of disease. The household comb was a bridge for lice, fungi, and infection, passed daily between women and children. The act of sharing, seen as harmless, became an invisible threat that shaped their health, and as hair carried away its silent burdens. Another part of daily life carried dangers too. Waiting in the water meant to cleanse the body itself. The bathtub in a Victorian home was not the shining porcelain image that comes to mind today. It was often a large wooden or metal tub, dragged into the centre of a room and filled with water that was precious and hard to heat. Families used it sparingly, which meant the same water was expected to serve several people in turn. A mother might step in first, followed by her daughters, then the servants, all dipping into the same cloudy bath. The water grew darker with each body that entered, yet no one considered it unfit for use. What looked like thrift and order was, in truth, the creation of a breeding ground for disease. Bathing was not a daily ritual in most homes. For many, once a week seemed more than enough. Clean water was not easy to obtain, and heating it required fuel that cost money. The idea of emptying the tub after one person's wash felt wasteful, so the practice of sharing became normal. The addition of a little hot water kept the bath feeling fresh enough, but the filth remained. Skin flakes, sweat, and dirt floated unseen, mixing into a broth that clung to the next bather's skin. The practice seemed reasonable to those who lived it. Families saw it as a sign of care, providing a shared chance to feel refreshed. The faint warmth of the water gave comfort, and the illusion of cleanliness was enough to please. It almost sounds laughable now to imagine calling such a filthy bath an act of hygiene. Yet in the crowded homes of Victorian towns, there were few alternatives. Privacy was rare, luxury rarer, and no one could afford to be wasteful. Cholera was the hidden consequence. The disease was already present in the water supplies of many cities, spreading through contaminated wells and pumps. Once it entered a household, a shared bathtub made sure it touched everyone. The water looked ordinary, perhaps only slightly clouded, but it carried bacteria strong enough to bring cramps, vomiting, and death within hours. Families could not see this danger. They stepped into the water with trust, unaware that it was carrying illness from one body to the next. The middle classes, who prided themselves on refinement, often followed this practice as well. They believed their homes were cleaner than those of the poor, yet their tubs were no different. Curtains were drawn, candles lit, and the ritual of bathing became part of family order. But no amount of order could change what was happening beneath the surface of the water. Bubbles that rose looked harmless, but they carried traces of waste and infection. Servants usually washed last. By then, the water was a heavy stew of oils and grime. Their bodies absorbed what others had left behind, and they often carried sickness more severely. Few paid attention when servants fell ill. It was easier to call them weak or unlucky than to question the routines of the household. The truth was less convenient. The very practice meant to clean was seeding disease. Doctors and reformers began to notice patterns. Outbreaks of cholera struck families who seemed healthy only days before. Whole neighbourhoods suffered at once, and the shared bathtub was often part of the story. Still, warnings were slow to spread. Hygiene was not yet understood in the way we know it today. Germ theory was still young, and many clung to older beliefs about bad air or weak constitutions. The tub, a fixture of domestic pride, did not look like a threat. Markets sold soaps and powders to add to the bath, but these did little to stop disease. The scents masked smells, not germs. Families sprinkled herbs into the water, hoping it would purify, but it only floated alongside the filth. The tub was not drained until every scheduled bather had finished. By then, the water was thick, murky, and carrying sickness that no one could see. If we compared it to modern times, it would be as though an entire neighbourhood tried to drink from the same unwashed glass, adding only a little water to stretch it further. Children often suffered first. Their smaller bodies were more vulnerable, and cholera showed no mercy. Parents tried to comfort them, unaware that the bath itself had delivered the illness. To the family, death seemed to come out of nowhere. Another tragedy in a world already full of them. Few connected the dots, and so the practice continued, repeated in households across the city. The shared tub also shaped how women experienced cleanliness. They were expected to appear neat and to smell presentable, yet were given no tools to achieve this safely. Their long skirts and petticoats carried dirt from outside into the water. When they stepped out of the bath, they felt renewed, but their skin often bore the beginnings of infection. The standards of appearance were met, while the body beneath grew weaker. I find it disturbing to imagine a ritual meant to refresh the body serving instead as a silent doorway to death. For the authorities, outbreaks of cholera were blamed on poverty and carelessness, but the middle classes suffered just the same. Disease did not respect social boundaries. The bath was a symbol of order and refinement, yet it betrayed every user. By sharing one tub, households guaranteed that if illness touched one member, it would touch them all. The ritual of bathing became a paradox. It was meant to be clean, but it did the opposite. It bound families together not in health, but in sickness. Each addition of warm water only extended the life of the danger floating inside. The comfort of the tub disguised the fact that it was no safer than a stagnant puddle in the street. The shared bathtub carried with it the illusion of hygiene, while quietly spreading cholera and other diseases through the very act of bathing. Families clung to the routine, blind to the risk, and the water that should have renewed them became their undoing. Yet water was not only dangerous in baths. Even in the tasks of washing clothes, women carried risks that could turn an ordinary act into a pathway for infection. The cloths used by women during their monthly bleeding were simple pieces of fabric, folded and refolded to absorb what they could. They were not disposable, not private, and certainly not sanitized. After use, these cloths were rinsed by hand in cold water, often without soap, and set aside to be used again. The act was done quickly, sometimes in the same tubs or basins that served the household for cooking and cleaning. What seemed like an efficient use of water and tools carried invisible risks that few could imagine. Blood clung to the fibres of the cloth, thickening with each use. Cold water removed some stains, but never all. The traces that remained became a place where bacteria thrived, hidden in folds that looked clean enough once dried. When these cloths were rinsed in basins later used to wash vegetables or boil soup, the contamination spread easily. It passed silently from one task to another, moving from the most intimate corners of a woman's body to the mouths of her family. For women, there was no clear understanding of hygiene during menstruation. The subject was private, rarely spoken of, and considered unfit for open discussion. With silence came ignorance. There were no separate basins for menstrual cloths, no rules to keep them apart from other items of the household. A woman might rinse her clothes and then use the same tub to wash her children's clothes. The overlap felt natural, even necessary. But it was an overlap that linked blood, food, and health in dangerous ways. The absence of soap made the problem worse. Soap was expensive and not always available, especially for the poor. Even when families had homemade soap, they saved it for visible dirt on hands or garments. Cloths used for menstruation did not seem to warrant such care. A quick rinse in cold water appeared sufficient. What the eyes could no longer see was assumed to be gone, In reality, bacteria remained, ready to multiply as the cloth dried in dark corners of the home. It almost seems absurd that a fabric soaked in blood could be dipped once in cold water and then considered ready for use again. Yet in Victorian homes, this was routine. There were no factories producing clean pads, no systems for safe disposal. Women made do with what they had, and what they had was never enough to be safe. The mixing of menstrual cloths with ordinary laundry blurred every boundary. Sheets, undergarments, and children's clothing were washed in the same tubs, rubbed side by side with cloths carrying dried blood. Sometimes the water was later poured into basins for scrubbing dishes. The cycle of reuse left no chance for separation. Families unknowingly consumed traces of what should have been carefully discarded. Doctors occasionally wrote of unexplained stomach illnesses or outbreaks of infection in homes where no outside cause could be found. They did not always connect the sickness to laundry, but the link was there, in cramped kitchens where food was prepared beside piles of laundry. The contamination was constant. Women touched blood-soaked cloths, rinsed them, and, without washing their hands thoroughly, turned to stir a pot or feed a child. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like rinsing a used medical bandage in the sink and then using that same sink to prepare dinner. Children suffered most from these hidden risks. Their bodies, still small and unprotected, reacted severely to bacteria carried into food and drink. Cases of diarrhea and fever were common, and death from such illnesses was frequent in poor districts. Families accepted this as fate, never realizing that their own practices were helping disease take hold. What looked like thrift and efficiency was in truth a routine of infection. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine mothers acting with care and duty, unknowingly passing illness into the mouths of their children. The contradiction is painful acts meant to protect the family instead harmed them. Women were not careless, they were left without knowledge, without tools, and without alternatives. Their silence was shaped by shame, and shame made them blind to the dangers they carried in their own hands. The air inside kitchens often carried the scent of boiling broth mixed with the damp smell of drying laundry. Cloths were hung in corners, sometimes beside food storage, where they gathered mould. The bacteria in the blood found perfect conditions in these places, dark, moist, and warm. When the clothes were taken again for use, they carried not just old stains but fresh colonies of infection. Women endured the discomfort, rarely questioning why rashes and sores grew worse after each cycle. Reformers who wrote about sanitation did not often address menstruation. It was a subject too hidden, too taboo. As a result, the dangers remained invisible in public debate. While cities fought cholera with new water systems, the private routines of women continued unchanged. Illness spread quietly within households, carried on by practices no one dared to challenge. This detail of life reveals how deeply poverty and ignorance shaped Victorian health. Women bore the burden of managing both their own bodies and the needs of the family, yet were given no safe means to do so. Cloths that should have been washed separately or discarded entirely became long-term tools of harm. Kitchens that should have been places of nourishment became laboratories of infection. The line between food and filth was crossed daily, and no one spoke of it. The story of menstrual cloths rinsed in cooking basins is not simply one of hygiene but of silence. Silence around women's bodies kept knowledge away, and without knowledge, every act carried hidden dangers. What looked ordinary was in fact extraordinary in its risk. The very fabric that women trusted became a vessel for harm, carrying bacteria from one cycle to the next, from private life into the meals of the household. The rinsing of menstrual cloths in cooking basins allowed bacteria to move freely from blood to food, creating illness that families never traced to its true cause. Women believed they were fulfilling their duties, but their practices only deepened the risks of daily life. And while water made dangerous by blood carried its own hidden costs, another practice of hiding smells with flowers would spread sickness in ways no one expected. Women in Victorian times often turned to flowers not just for decoration, but as a shield against their own bodies. Instead of washing regularly, many placed dried lavender or rose petals inside their undergarments, or tucked them between the layers of their heavy dresses. At first, the fragrance seemed to mask the odour of sweat, giving the impression of cleanliness and refinement. The flowers were easy to obtain, they looked delicate, and they carried with them a sense of respectability. Yet once pressed against warm, damp skin, they quickly transformed from tokens of freshness into hidden nests of decay. Moisture from the body soaked into the petals. What had been crisp and fragrant soon became soggy and discoloured. Within days, the flowers began to rot, turning soft and dark, clinging to fabric and skin. Their dampness provided the perfect breeding ground for mould, which spread quietly in folds of cloth. The smell that emerged was not the sweet perfume once promised, but a sour, rancid stench that grew stronger each day. It feels almost ridiculous that something meant to cover a bad smell became the source of an even worse one. Women endured this because the alternative felt shameful. Talking about body odour was considered indecent, and bathing often was not practical. Without access to proper soap and water, the insertion of flowers seemed like a clever solution. It gave a sense of effort, a gesture toward refinement, even if the results were the opposite. Society rewarded appearances, and no one wanted to admit that beneath elegant gowns lay damp blossoms turning into mush. The problem was more than unpleasant smells. The constant contact of rotting petals against sensitive skin caused irritation. Women developed rashes that itched and burned. Small sores appeared, which became infected as bacteria thrived in the moist environment. In severe cases, swollen lymph nodes and pus-filled abscesses developed, leaving women weak and in pain. They rarely connected these health problems to the flowers they carried daily. Illness was considered fate, not a consequence of personal habits. The contrast between the outward elegance of a lady and the hidden rot beneath her dress is stark. Guests at a gathering might admire the fragrance of lavender in the air, never realizing that the scent mixed with the sourness of decay. The effort to appear refined turned into a trap of discomfort and disease. Yet because everyone followed similar practices, the problem became invisible. No one questioned it, and no one stopped. Markets encouraged the habit. Stalls sold bundles of dried herbs and flowers, advertising them as purifiers of the body. Pamphlets praised lavender as a cure for foul odours and rose petals as a natural cleanser. These claims were comforting, cheap, and easy to believe. Women carried sachets of petals in their clothing, never suspecting that once trapped in sweat, the cure became a poison. If we imagine this in modern terms, it would be like placing air fresheners inside clothing instead of taking a shower. Servants often copied their mistresses, filling their own clothes with crushed petals. They had even fewer opportunities for proper bathing, so they relied heavily on these tricks. Their physical labour meant more sweat, which meant the flowers decayed faster. The irritation on their skin was worse, but complaints were rarely heard. They continued with their work, scratching beneath heavy dresses, enduring the burning discomfort in silence. I find it unsettling to think of women believing they were protecting themselves from shame while actually carrying mould and infection pressed tightly against their skin. The irony is heavy. They trusted in something gentle and fragrant, never realizing it was turning against them. Each day, as they dressed, they repeated the same mistake, a mistake encouraged by the standards of their society. Inside crowded rooms, the problem multiplied. Heat from gatherings caused women to sweat more, and the flowers decayed faster. The combined odours of mould, sweat, and perfume filled the air, sometimes strong enough to cause faintness. Accounts exist of women collapsing in theatres or assemblies, where the mix of smells became unbearable. These incidents were rarely blamed on hygiene. People pointed instead to weak nerves or poor ventilation, leaving the true causes unspoken. The habit reveals the tension of the era. Victorian society valued appearance above truth, elegance above health. Women bore the pressure of this standard most heavily, forced to hide their natural bodies in layers of fabric and false remedies. They were trapped between shame and ignorance, their solutions making them sick while their silence kept them from seeking change. The flowers that symbolized purity were in reality breeding grounds for disease. This detail of life shows how easily beauty and health were sacrificed for the sake of social expectations. A fragrant solution became a source of rot, and women accepted it as normal. They carried on with routines that harmed them, convinced they were doing the right thing. In this way, the standards of refinement became instruments of suffering, turning ordinary flowers into silent threats. Dried flowers hidden in clothing were meant to mask odour, but they created rot, irritation, and infection instead. Women believed they were guarding their dignity, yet they only exposed themselves to new dangers. And while flowers caused illness pressed against the skin, even the clothes themselves, unwashed and unchanged, carried risks that grew worse with every passing day. The theatres of Victorian cities were places of elegance, with velvet curtains, polished balconies, and chandeliers glowing above the crowds. Women arrived in layers of gowns, their dresses heavy with fabric and ornament. From a distance, the sight was magnificent, but closer inspection revealed a far less graceful truth. Beneath the folds of silk and lace, there were hidden bundles of dried flowers, sachets of herbs, and garments that had not been washed for weeks. Heat from the crowded hall and the weight of the clothes turned these secret additions into something far more dangerous than perfume. As bodies pressed together in tight rows, the scents began to mix. Sweat soaked into the gowns, dampening the flowers and herbs sewn or stuffed into place. Instead of masking odour, the combination created a sour, sickly smell, sharp enough to sting the nose. Accounts from the time described the stench rising from women's dresses as comparable to rotting waste. The irony was striking what had been meant as elegance turned into decay. It is almost humorous in the darkest way that a society obsessed with refinement ended up making its theatres smell like compost heaps. The chemical reactions were not imaginary. Sweat mixed with the oils of dried petals, with powders sprinkled into the layers of cloth, and with the dust of city streets carried in by hems dragging along the ground. The result was a damp, fermenting stew pressed tightly against skin. As hours passed in warm, airless theatres, the fumes grew heavier. In one recorded case from 1874, the air around 5 women seated together became so unbearable that another lady in the same row fainted. The cause was not weakness, as many suggested, but the sheer force of the odour. Theatre staff struggled with this reality. Ventilation was poor, and windows were rarely opened during performances. Gas lamps added heat, raising the temperature even further. Patrons fanned themselves, but the movement only stirred the smells around the room. Men removed their gloves to wipe sweat, while women shifted uncomfortably under their layers of fabric. Yet none of this discomfort was spoken of openly. To criticise a lady's scent was to breach decorum, even if the stench was overwhelming. The women themselves often had no idea how strong the odour became. They believed that the flowers and sachets were doing their work. Friends complimented one another on their appearance, and silence kept the truth hidden. But anyone seated nearby could not escape the result. The mingling of sweat, mould, and perfume filled the lungs of the audience as surely as smoke filled the streets outside. If we compared this to modern times, it would be like walking into a cinema where every seat cushion had been soaked in spoiled milk and then sprayed with cheap perfume. For the poorer women, the problem was worse. They could not afford finer fabrics or frequent laundering. Their dresses were made of wool or heavy cotton, which absorbed sweat quickly and held it. Adding flowers was their only attempt at elegance, but the practice backfired. By the end of an evening, their clothes carried the smell of both labour and decay. Theatres that sought to represent refinement were filled instead with a mixture of foulness rising from hundreds of bodies packed close together. I find it disturbing to picture rows of smiling women, proud in their finery, while the air around them grew so foul that others collapsed. It was not malice, not neglect, but ignorance shaped by shame. Cleanliness was expected, yet the means to achieve it were out of reach. Covering the problem with flowers seemed clever, but it only created new dangers. The fainting in theatres was a visible reminder of what society preferred not to see. The incident in 1874 was not unique. Newspapers occasionally reported cases of fainting in crowded halls, attributing them to weak nerves, overexcitement, or poor ventilation. Rarely did they point directly to the odour rising from gowns. To admit such a cause would expose too much, suggesting that the very symbols of refinement were hiding filth. Instead, the myth of delicate constitutions continued, protecting social appearances while ignoring the reality. Inside the homes of these women, the problem began long before the theatre. Dresses were seldom washed because of their bulk and cost. Layers of undergarments absorbed sweat but were reused repeatedly without proper cleaning. Flowers and sachets were added each day, pressed deeper into folds that were already damp. By the time the evening performance began, the dresses carried weeks of accumulated decay. The heat of the crowd simply released it into the air. This detail of Victorian life reveals a pattern repeated in many areas. Appearance mattered more than truth, and solutions that seemed elegant often carried hidden harm. Theatres stood as symbols of culture, but inside them, the smell of rot betrayed the fragility of those symbols. The collapse of a woman in her seat was not just a personal misfortune, but a reflection of how society's habits turned refinement into risk. The gowns filled with flowers that turned sour created suffocating odours, strong enough to overwhelm and even cause fainting in public halls. What looked like refinement was in truth a slow fermentation of sweat and petals sealed in heavy fabric. The discomfort was ignored, and the fainting dismissed, but the problem lingered, carried forward into every gathering. From the theatre to the drawing room, the same unwashed clothes spread their hidden dangers. The garments closest to a Victorian woman's skin were rarely spoken of but always present. Beneath the silk, cotton, and lace that met the eye lay underlayers of wool, most often coarse linen or heavy flannel. These garments clung to the body every day, absorbing sweat, oil, and dirt from skin that was seldom washed. Women wore 3, sometimes 5 layers of clothing, and the inner layer of wool was in constant contact with their flesh. It trapped heat in winter and soaked through in summer, yet it was almost never laundered. Instead of washing, women hung the wool to dry, allowing moisture to evaporate but leaving behind everything else. Over time, the fabric became stiff, sour, and alive with bacteria. Wool has natural properties that make it both durable and insulating. It was valued because it held its shape and protected against the cold. But the same fibres that made it resilient also made it an excellent sponge for odour. Sweat absorbed into wool did not easily wash out, even when water was used. In homes where water was scarce and soap expensive, true washing was avoided. Women believed airing garments near a fire or in the open air was enough. The smell might lessen, but the bacteria remained. Each time the garment touched the skin again, the cycle of irritation and infection grew worse. The smell of such undergarments was described in some accounts as unbearable, especially when women gathered in close spaces. Doctors and reformers who visited poor neighbourhoods noted the strong, sour odour that clung to households. This odour came not only from bodies, but from the layers of wool that had not been cleaned in months, sometimes years. The garments fermented slowly, like damp cloth left in a cellar. What looked like refinement on the surface dresses of bright colours, polished shoes hid rot underneath. It almost sounds absurd that women thought they could present elegance while carrying wool soaked in months of sweat under their gowns. For women, the irritation of wearing unwashed wool was constant. Rashes spread across thighs and stomachs, especially in summer when sweat was heavy. The fabric rubbed against skin, leaving raw patches that never had a chance to heal. Infections found easy entry through these wounds, abscesses developed, and the pain was ignored until it became severe. Women were expected to endure discomfort in silence. To complain about the state of their undergarments would be to admit a lack of refinement, so they said nothing. The custom of layering worsened the problem. Each additional skirt trapped heat and moisture, pressing the wool closer to the body. Air could not circulate, and the weight of the fabric prevented skin from drying. In winter, this meant constant dampness, which led to chills and respiratory sickness. In summer, it meant unbearable heat, prickly rashes, and sores that spread beneath clothing. The smell followed women everywhere, though society's strict manners meant few dared to mention it aloud. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like wearing the same pair of gym clothes every day for months, never washing them, only letting them air out in the corner of a room. The thought is disgusting, yet in Victorian households, it was not considered unusual. Laundry was laborious and expensive. Wool was heavy, slow to dry, and difficult to scrub clean. Many believed it would ruin the fabric to wash it too often, so they avoided the task entirely. Servants bore the worst of this routine. They were responsible for hanging the garments to dry, sometimes catching the overwhelming odour in small, damp rooms. They too wore wool, passed down from their employers, even more worn and rarely washed. Their work required heavy labour, which meant more sweat, more dirt, and greater irritation. When they fell ill with infections of the skin or lungs, it was treated as weakness rather than the result of clothing that acted as a breeding ground for bacteria. I cannot help but think how cruel it must have been to live under these standards, expected to look elegant in public while enduring the misery of sores and foul smells in private. The hypocrisy of the age is striking. Society prized appearances, yet its women carried hidden burdens that ate away at their health. The wool that kept them warm also poisoned their skin day by day. Inside homes, the ritual of hanging wool to dry was treated as enough. Women draped garments near fireplaces, hoping the smoke would cleanse them. Others placed them by open windows, trusting fresh air to do the work. Neither method removed the build-up of sweat and dirt embedded deep in the fibres. The garments stiffened, turned yellow, and carried stains that never left. When finally discarded, they were often handed down to servants or poorer relatives, spreading the problem further. Doctors who saw cases of chronic skin infections sometimes noted the connection to unwashed clothing, but their voices carried little influence. The idea that garments themselves could cause illness was unfamiliar. Most preferred to blame weak constitutions, poor diets, or simple misfortune. Without clear knowledge of germs, the obvious link remained invisible. The wool was accepted as necessary, part of a woman's life, no matter what it did to her body. Social gatherings magnified the issue, in parlours, theatres, or churches. The air was thick with the combined odour of hundreds of women wearing the same unwashed garments. Fainting spells were attributed to poor ventilation or delicate nerves. Rarely did anyone dare suggest that the dresses themselves were to blame. Respectability required silence, even as the smell became overwhelming. This silence allowed the practice to continue without challenge. This detail of daily life shows the contradiction of the Victorian world. The same society that celebrated morality and discipline tolerated habits that spread illness and decay. Women's suffering was hidden under the weight of fabric, their pain dismissed as natural. The wool that should have offered comfort became instead a carrier of infection. It was an ordinary object turned dangerous through neglect and ignorance. The woolen undergarments worn daily by Victorian women absorbed sweat, odours, and bacteria until they became sources of illness. They were never washed, only aired, and so they carried infection from one day to the next. What seemed like thrift and propriety was in reality a dangerous routine that spread rashes, sores, and disease. The hidden risks did not end with clothing, however. because even the utensils used for bathing crossed into the world of food, turning hygiene into a direct path towards sickness. The cooking pot was one of the most important objects in a Victorian home. It was the vessel in which porridge was boiled, soups were stirred, and bread was steamed. Yet in many poorer households, that same pot was also used to heat water for bathing. Fuel was costly, and families owned only a few large vessels. To them, it seemed practical to use one pot for every need. After the water cooled and was poured into a tub, the pot was left with traces of skin, dirt, and even clumps of hair. By morning it would be back on the fire, filled with oats or broth, ready to feed the entire family. The practice seemed like common sense at the time. Tools were scarce, and water was heavy to carry. A single large pot was a family's lifeline, so it had to serve every purpose. No one saw the danger in boiling bath water in the same pot used for food. Boiling was thought to cleanse, but in reality, not everything was destroyed. Dirt stuck to the metal, oily scum clung to the sides, and scraps from skin or nails remained. When food was prepared in the same pot, all of these traces joined it unseen. The result was contamination that spread silently. Families ate porridge flavoured not only by oats, but by whatever the bath had left behind. A toenail scraped into the water, a patch of dead skin softened by heat, or a sore washed clean of pus. All of it found its way back into mouths the next day. It almost sounds absurd that families thought boiling away the grime was enough, as if a few bubbles could erase filth. But in Victorian homes where money was short, no one imagined they had a choice. This habit was especially dangerous when someone had wounds or skin infections. Open sores leaked bacteria into the bath water. Once the water was emptied, the residue clung stubbornly to the pot. The next morning, broth ladled from the same vessel carried invisible threats straight into the stomachs of children. Illness followed quickly, often with vomiting, cramps, and fever. Parents rarely connected the sickness to the pot. They assumed weak bodies or bad luck were to blame. The kitchens of poor households were cramped, with little space for separation. Food preparation, laundry, and bathing often overlapped. The pot at the centre of the room carried the marks of every task. Its blackened sides bore scratches from spoons, knives, and nails alike. The smell of cooked grain mingled with the sour odour of used bath water. Families accepted this as ordinary. They did not see contamination, only practicality. Markets offered no easy solution. Large pots were expensive, and few could afford more than one. Soap strong enough to scrub away grease and bacteria was also costly. Many families wiped their pots with rags or rinsed them briefly with water, believing this was enough. In truth, the rags themselves were often filthy, spreading bacteria further. The pot never truly became clean. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like washing dirty socks in the same blender used later to make a smoothie. The thought is revolting now, but to Victorians it was simply life. The danger was not just in the pot, but in the culture of silence around hygiene. Speaking of dirt was considered rude, and many believed that what could not be seen did not matter. Women carried the burden of maintaining the household, yet they lacked knowledge and resources. They repeated the practices their mothers had taught them, unaware that they were carrying illness forward. Each meal seemed nourishing, but hidden within it was the residue of the previous night's bath. I find it deeply troubling to picture children eating from bowls filled with porridge cooked in the same pot that had held their family's dirty bathwater hours earlier. It is not just the physical filth that shocks, but the thought of how normal it was considered. The families did not mean harm. They acted from necessity, trying to stretch their few possessions as far as possible. Poverty left them no safer choice. Outbreaks of stomach illness were common. Diarrhea, vomiting, and fevers swept through neighbourhoods, claiming lives silently. Doctors treated the symptoms but rarely traced the cause back to cooking pots. Without knowledge of bacteria, they blamed spoiled food or weak constitutions. The true culprit remained hidden in plain sight. blackened by fire and filled each day with new dangers. Inside the homes, the cycle repeated endlessly. Bath water by night, porridge by morning, stew by evening. The pot was never empty for long. It carried the weight of every meal and every body, absorbing traces of both. Families trusted it, never questioning what it carried forward. To them, it was not a source of sickness, but a symbol of survival. This detail shows how deeply intertwined necessity and danger were in Victorian life. The poor made do with what they had, and what they had betrayed them. The very object that kept families alive with food also brought them to sickness. It was an ordinary item turned into a silent agent of disease, not through neglect, but through desperation. The use of one pot for both bathing and cooking spread illness directly into the mouths of families, disguising contamination as nourishment. They trusted the vessel that fed them, never realizing it carried infection from body to body. As meals passed from kitchen to table, another risk was already waiting in the same households, carried not in food but in the unwashed hands that touched children each day. A mother's hands were the most trusted tools in a Victorian household. They fed children, dressed them, and soothed them when they cried. Yet those same hands often carried dangers no one could see. After changing a soiled cloth or wiping a child, many mothers went directly to feeding without washing. Soap was absent in most homes, and water alone was thought sufficient if it was used at all. What seemed like ordinary care became a hidden pathway for sickness, moving silently from hand to mouth. The idea of germs was not widely understood. Most families believed that dirt was visible, and if nothing could be seen, nothing harmful remained. The natural scent of the body was considered harmless, even healthy. Mothers did not think twice about preparing porridge immediately after touching waste. A baby held close was fed with the same hands that had just cleaned filth. No one suspected that those hands were carrying invisible threats into fragile bodies. The consequences were severe. Infants and young children were especially vulnerable. Their small stomachs and weak immune systems could not fight the bacteria passed into their mouths. Diarrhea struck quickly, leaving children weak, dehydrated, and feverish. Many never recovered. Records from the time show that infants died more often at home than in hospitals, not because hospitals were unsafe, but because at least some cleanliness was enforced there. It almost feels grimly ironic that the same hands meant to nourish a child were also delivering the poison that killed them. The lack of soap was central to the problem. Even when families owned a bar, it was often saved for laundry or special occasions. Everyday tasks were done with bare rinsing. If that, water used for cleaning might itself be drawn from contaminated wells, adding more bacteria rather than removing it. The notion of scrubbing hands between tasks simply did not exist. Mothers moved from one duty to another without pause, carrying traces of waste into every corner of the home. In cramped kitchens and nurseries, the risks multiplied. A mother wiped a baby, rinsed the cloth in a basin, then reached for a spoon to feed another child. The same spoon might be licked clean, wiped on a sleeve, and used again. Family members shared cups and bowls, spreading bacteria further. Each small act seemed ordinary, but together they created a cycle of infection that devastated households. If we compared this to modern life, it would be like preparing an infant's bottle immediately after handling raw sewage, with no thought of washing in between. Mothers carried guilt when children grew sick, but they rarely knew the cause. They blamed weak constitutions, bad air, or fate. When several children in a neighbourhood died in the same week, families believed it was misfortune, not shared practices. Few imagined that their own hands were the bridge between waste and food. The silence around hygiene meant the pattern continued unchecked, generation after generation. I find it heartbreaking to imagine mothers holding their infants close, believing they were offering safety, while unknowingly passing on the very illness that would take them away. It was not neglect, but ignorance, enforced by poverty and tradition. The knowledge that could have saved lives was not available to them. Instead, grief became a routine part of motherhood, accepted as unavoidable. The numbers were staggering. Infant mortality was high across Victorian society, but among the poor, it was catastrophic. Homes without soap, with limited water, and with no awareness of germs became breeding grounds for illness. Doctors who studied the problem saw the connection but struggled to convince others. Advice about washing hands was often dismissed as unnecessary or even insulting. Cleanliness was thought of as a matter of appearance, not as protection from disease. Inside households, mothers did what they thought was best. They rocked their babies, spooned broth into their mouths, and wiped their faces with the same hands that had just cleaned waste. Each gesture was an act of love wrapped in risk. Families buried child after child, believing that God or chance had taken them, while the truth lay in habits repeated daily. This detail of life exposes the cruel divide of the age. Wealthier families, with servants and better access to water, had slightly lower rates of infant death. Poor families suffered endlessly, their children falling ill in numbers too high to ignore. Yet society accepted these deaths as natural, another cost of poverty. The mothers themselves were never told that the answer lay in something as simple as soap and water. The story of unwashed hands is not just about hygiene. It is about silence, ignorance, and the weight of poverty pressing down on the most ordinary acts of care. Mothers gave all they had, but their lack of knowledge turned love into danger. The hands that should have guarded life became the carriers of death, unseen and unacknowledged. The unwashed hands of Victorian mothers carried bacteria from waste to food, making infants sick and leading to countless deaths at home. What appeared to be tender care was in truth the hidden cause of suffering. As children grew, another danger awaited them, clinging not to hands but to the very clothes their mothers wore as they walked the filthy streets. The dresses worn by Victorian women were not light garments that brushed the ankles. They were long, layered, and heavy, designed to drag across the ground. Hemlines swept the streets, dipping into mud, dust, and the waste left behind by animals and people alike. In crowded markets, the cloth touched rotting vegetables, spilled milk, and the slime of fishmongers' stalls. In public latrines, it brushed against puddles of urine and streaks of human filth. Each step gathered a new layer of contamination. Yet when the women returned home, they carried these same skirts across parlours and bedrooms, pressing them into chairs, sofas, and beds. What looked like elegance in the street became an invisible flood of bacteria inside the home. The construction of these dresses made them especially dangerous. Multiple layers of fabric meant that dirt did not simply fall away. Moisture clung to the wool and cotton, seeping into the weave, and remained trapped there. Once the fabric dried, the marks were less visible, but the bacteria remained. The hems became darkened, stiff, and foul-smelling. Yet laundering such massive garments was rare. Washing took time, fuel, and labour that many households could not spare. Instead, skirts were shaken out at the door or hung briefly in fresh air before being worn again. This practice meant that the very symbols of refinement acted as carriers of disease. In drawing rooms where families gathered, skirts spread whatever they had collected across upholstered furniture. Infants crawled on rugs that had been brushed by hems soaked in the filth of city streets. Husbands leaned against fabric that had touched latrine floors. No one recognized the risk because the contamination was invisible. It almost sounds laughable that the most fashionable dresses were also the dirtiest rags in the city. Public spaces were full of hazards. Streets were rarely cleaned, and animals left waste everywhere. Markets overflowed with spoiled produce. Human sewage drained poorly, leaving puddles that never dried. Long skirts acted like sponges, gathering everything the city dropped. Even wealthy women who prided themselves on dignity returned home with skirts heavy with filth. Poorer women, who spent more time outdoors, carried even more. The infection did not stop at the doorstep. It came inside with every fold of cloth. Children paid a high price. They clung to their mothers' skirts or sat in their laps, pressing their faces against fabric soaked in germs. They sucked their thumbs after handling cloth that had been dragged through gutters. Stomach illnesses spread quickly in such homes, leaving children weak and dehydrated. Parents rarely suspected the skirts. They blamed bad luck or weak constitutions, never realizing that the disease had been carried in on hems brushing the ground. The smell of these garments was often overwhelming. Observers noted that gatherings of women created a mix of odours, sweat, perfume, and the sour stench of fabric steeped in waste. Theatres and churches were thick with it, though etiquette forbade anyone from mentioning it aloud. Ventilation was poor, so the stench lingered, clinging to every surface. Still, the dresses were admired for their volume and elegance. The irony was complete society praised the very garments that brought sickness into its most private spaces. If we compare this habit to modern life, it would be like mopping the floor of a public restroom with a long towel and then spreading that towel across the family sofa. The absurdity is clear now, but in Victorian times, no one thought this strange. The standards of fashion demanded long skirts, and women obeyed. Few questioned how those skirts functioned as carriers of disease. I find it chilling to picture women settling into bed, still wearing garments that had just been dragged through streets smeared with human waste. They believed they were respectable, clean, and proper, even while lying in fabric steeped in filth. The blindness was not chosen. It was created by ignorance, by poverty, and by rigid standards that valued appearance above safety. The danger extended beyond homes. In hospitals, where cleanliness should have mattered most, nurses wore long skirts as well. These garments brushed against sick beds, picked up fluids, and carried them to other patients. Infection spread silently, aided by uniforms designed for modesty rather than hygiene. Doctors noted the high rates of cross-contamination, but did not always understand the role of clothing. The hemline, considered a symbol of dignity, was in fact a vector of disease. Even among the wealthy, who owned more garments and had servants to clean them, the problem remained. Laundering was still infrequent, and the skirts still touched the same filthy streets. Servants tasked with shaking out or brushing down the garments often became ill themselves, breathing in dust filled with waste. They had no choice but to handle the fabrics daily, carrying risks into their own lives. The persistence of this habit shows how deeply fashion could override practicality. Women were judged by their appearance, not their health. To wear shorter skirts was to risk shame, as it suggested poverty or immorality. So they endured the weight, the odour, and the danger, never questioning why refinement had to mean filth. Reformers spoke of improving sanitation in streets and water supplies, but they rarely mentioned clothing. The problem remained invisible, even while it touched every household. Over time, the unwashed skirts contributed to widespread illness. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly in urban neighbourhoods. Families wondered how the disease reached them when they had never left home, not realising that it had arrived on the hem of their own garments. The skirts acted as mobile carriers, sweeping up germs from the city and depositing them in parlours, kitchens, and bedrooms. The detail of long skirts dragging across filth reveals once again the contradictions of Victorian life. A society obsessed with propriety created habits that undermined its health. Women bore the weight of these contradictions literally on their bodies, walking with pride in garments that quietly endangered their families. The skirts represented status and refinement, yet they were more dangerous than any visible dirt. The heavy skirts of Victorian women swept up filth from streets and latrines, carrying it into homes and spreading illness without anyone realising. They were praised as fashionable but functioned as tools of infection. From skirts dragging through waste, another danger waited in the world of fashion itself: hidden not in fabric but in the false beauty of cosmetics designed to frame the eyes. False eyelashes in Victorian times were nothing like the carefully manufactured products sold today. They were crude, heavy, and often attached to substances that would horrify a modern reader. Women sought to make their eyes appear larger and more dramatic, following a growing fashion that linked long lashes with innocence and beauty. To achieve this look, they glued strands of human hair or animal fur onto their eyelids. The lashes themselves were unsanitary, sometimes collected from barbers' floors or from old wigs. Yet the real danger was not the lashes but the glue. One of the most common adhesives used at the time was melted fat taken from dead rats. It was cheap, sticky, and widely available, but it carried with it contamination and rot. The process of creating this glue was simple and disgusting. Rat carcasses were collected, and their bodies were boiled down until the fat floated to the surface. The fat was skimmed off, cooled, and stored for later use. Mixed with other ingredients, it became a thick paste applied directly to the eyelids. Women smeared this near the delicate tissue of the eye, trusting it to hold the lashes in place. The smell was unpleasant, but perfume or scented powders were often added to disguise it. Fashion overruled caution. It is almost darkly amusing that refinement in Victorian society sometimes meant rubbing decomposed rat fat onto one's eyelids. The eyes are among the most vulnerable parts of the body. The skin around them is thin, and the surface of the eye is easily scratched. Once contaminated glue was applied, infection often followed. Women developed redness, swelling, and burning sensations almost immediately. Yet these were dismissed as normal side effects of beauty. The lashes were heavy, pulling at the lids, making the eyes water constantly. Many assumed this discomfort was the price of fashion. In truth, they were exposing themselves to severe infections that could lead to permanent damage. Cases of keratitis, an inflammation of the cornea, became common. Doctors noted women arriving with inflamed, clouded eyes after using false lashes. Pus gathered at the corners, vision blurred, and in the worst cases, blindness followed. Still, the practice continued. No laws prevented the sale of dangerous cosmetics, and the women who suffered were often blamed for their own vanity. The cycle of harm repeated itself as sellers moved from district to district, promising beauty with every jar of glue. The irony was harsh. The empire celebrated progress in medicine and science, yet women were gluing rotting animal fat to their eyelids. There were no safety standards, no product testing, no protection. The fashion industry operated in the shadows, producing goods that appealed to appearances while ignoring health. A woman might look elegant at a gathering, her lashes long and dark, but by morning her eyes could be swollen shut. If we compared this to today, it would be like attaching false lashes with glue made from spoiled meat fat sold on a street corner. The problem was not limited to the glue. The lashes themselves carried risks. Hair was rarely cleaned before being reused. Strands might come from wigs, barbershops, or even animals freshly skinned. Dust, lice, and bacteria clung to them. Once pressed against the eyelid, they introduced further contamination. Women thought they were enhancing beauty, but they were in fact attaching small colonies of germs directly to their faces. I cannot help but feel a deep unease imagining women staring into mirrors, carefully applying lashes while unknowingly placing infection so close to their vision. The image is haunting because it was not a rare act. It was part of everyday life for those who wished to meet the strict beauty standards of their time. They had no reason to think the lashes were dangerous, only reason to fear being judged without them. The practice also revealed social divides. Wealthier women could afford professionally prepared lashes and glues, though these were hardly safer. Poorer women made do with whatever they could find. Some concocted their own adhesives from animal fat mixed with resin, boiling scraps in kitchens already full of filth. Others bought cheap bundles of hair sold in markets without asking where they came from. In both cases, the results were the same: red eyes, infection, and often long-term damage. Doctors who treated these conditions sometimes wrote reports, but their warnings were drowned out by the booming trade in beauty. Fashion magazines continued to promote long lashes as a mark of elegance. Illustrations showed women with dark, dramatic eyes, without mention of the cost. Beauty was equated with morality and status, and so women risked their health to